so much for joining us for this webinar on preventing fraud and embezzlement. I see we have a good number of folks who've joined us in this session. Today I am joined by Andrew Moll, who is the corporate treasurer for Adventist Risk Management and has a strong background in finance. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Dave. I appreciate you inviting me to be part of this. I've always enjoyed money, I guess, not as a goal in itself, but as a tool. And I think it's important for our church to be efficient and effective in how we use money.
Absolutely right. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And you have quite an education in this background. So we're going to appreciate your perspective and comments as we go through. I think that our other team member, Elizabeth Camps, has already sent out a message to everyone in using the chat feature.
I want to reaffirm something that Elizabeth said in the chat. If those of you listening might not have noticed that, if you do have questions or thoughts throughout the presentation, we do invite you to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. My apologies if we don't get to absolutely every question that gets asked. We will do our best to follow up offline with those we miss. We'll try to hit those that are more frequent, but we're trying to fit a lot of information into a fairly limited amount of time. So we may not catch absolutely everything. All right, so let's get started and dive into our presentation here today. One of the reasons why we're having this presentation is because the church has experienced some losses, and there's been a bit of an increase in those losses in the area of monetary fidelity just in recent years. The loss ratio for the church, working with our insurance carrier in this area, is not where it ought to be. So there are so many, and I suspect that I'm preaching to the choir. Andrew, we likely don't have folks looking to commit fraud on the line. What we have are folks who are really invested in protecting church assets, are the ones who are listening in today. And I think that's good, because what we're going to be focused on to a great degree is more ways that we can continue to look for red flags, ways that we can protect church's assets, and what we can focus on going forward.
Yeah, and maybe we know everything already, but it's always good to be refreshed on things and to relook at things from a different perspective.
Absolutely right.
That's what we're doing.
You and I had the opportunity to talk a few times while we were preparing the presentation, and it was a lot of fun to discuss through some of these things and some of the personal experiences, and so hopefully we'll bring that conversation. It'll be interesting and informative for those who are joining, and I suspect we have all different types of experience levels. So I just wanted to share, as we got started, this quote. I've been in a quote sharing mood recently. I did another presentation earlier today, and it was filled with quotes. This one's from Ellen White Manuscript Releases, and I just want to read it for the group here. I've been instructed in regard to the importance of our ministers keeping free from responsibilities that should be largely borne by businessmen. Your work is not the management of financial matters. It is not wise for you to undertake this. God has burdens for you to bear. But if you carry lines of work for which you are not adapted, your efforts in presenting the word will prove unsuccessful. And I share this not to, I know I'm probably not speaking to the ministerial folks right now, but this is just a clear message for those of us who work on the business side, in the business matters of the church, that this is an important role, that we need to lead in this area. We need to take it very seriously, and I'll share more quotes a little later on and as we go through, but I think this is a strong affirmation for the work that those on this webinar right now
Yeah, on that quote, I really like the part where it's not adapted. Like you can become adapted by learning and getting training, and that's something that that's what this webinar is about. Obviously, we're doing that, and there's other ways to do that too. But it's something that you can work towards. It's not just I can do that and we can do that. It's a team effort.
It is. It is a team effort. All right, so moving forward, here we go. I wanted to, if I just having a little bit of fun with my computer here. Here we go.
Coming.
I wanted to set also a little bit of a tone as we look at this of normally when risk management is, when we're doing presentations, we speak on matters of risk. We speak on in areas where the church experienced losses, right? So it's natural to look at any one of those topics and get really focused on, okay, here's the scary bad things that have happened, will happen, can happen. And I am passionate believer that that is not our best decision-making mindset. It's important, but there are some very strong motivations for us that are not fear-based, that are not just looking at the very scary types of things. There are positive motivations, and one that comes to my mind is, you go back to that story in the Bible that where Jesus is sitting there and he observes this widow who puts in two tiny little, probably the smallest monetary amount possible into the offering plate at the temple. And he really affirms that she gave her all. And I'm reminded of that in everything that we do. That small amount is of great importance to the Lord. It's of great importance to the Lord's work. And the dollars that we spend in, no matter what it is, whether it's, beautifying our facilities, whether it's administrative people who are traveling on behalf of the church, no matter what we do, it is God's people's offerings that are being used. That's an awesome responsibility and motivating to me of how can I use this most effectively? How can I protect those assets so that they are used for their intended use? I think about that quite a bit, and I think, yes, I will be held accountable by God for what we do. I also, and maybe this is just a little bit more, close to home, I'm going to be held accountable by that grandma in a sense, right? And that's motivating to me in a very positive way. Did I use her two mites the way they were intended?
Yeah, I really think that if we want to be responsible, and it's not, a lot of times I think we're talking about money in the church, we were like, oh, that's just the treasurer's responsibility, and I'm a treasurer, so that's, I hear that, oh, that's just Andrew's area, he needs to work in that area, but it's everyone's responsibility. I think like in a local church, like you have the deacon that's collecting the offering, that's a risk. They can take the money out of the offering plate. They're not a treasurer. It's the full scope of all people involved in the church processes. And then we have this thing called stewardship that Dave was mentioning or hinting at, that we're God has entrusted things to our care as church employees or as church members with board positions and ministries that are under us. We have this responsibility to take care of the resources entrusted with us. I think of ethics too. Like I went to Andrews University, and when I graduated from there, we did this code of ethics, like pledge, on the week of graduation. And I think the thought of that was, hey, we're going to be going out into the business world, and we're going to be representing ourselves. And you hear about this a lot in corporate America too. They have all these codes of ethics and responsibilities. And most corporations, that their focus is to create profit and money for their shareholders. But I would say that as a church, and as people that are involved in the church structure, we have even a higher calling, because we're being stewards of the money entrusted with us. We're not just here to make a profit for some person above us. We're here to take care of what God has entrusted with us, and that's the supreme calling, I'd say. And we all have a service to our church family like this. We all have different gifts, and maybe someone's gift is to mow the grass or go out and shovel snow or something. But part of the responsibility is also to take care of the finances of the church and to shepherd those and to make sure that they've been being guarded carefully, and watch out for them, because the devil can tempt us faster than we think a lot of times.
Yep. So let's just sort of that's our tone, and with that comes a great big thank you, certainly from me, and I think you'll join me in that, to all those. You actually serve as a treasurer at your church.
Yeah, I'm an assistant treasurer. I'm not the full treasurer.
So you're thank you, Andrew, for what you do there, because that's a lot of work goes into those volunteer positions, and it's important. So you shared the next quote with me, and
I got one quote on you.
Love for you to walk us through, because I think this is great.
I'll read this. So, by 3 methods we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is noblest. Second, by imitation, which is easiest. And third, by experience, which is the bitterest. And you think on this, like from a church finance perspective, you can reflect, and you can, hey, we're going to plan ahead for possible our fraud measures that are going to be stopping fraud from happening in our church. And that's the noblest thing that we can be doing. That's what ARM and us is encouraging people to do. But then we can also get advice from others. Like you always hear that learning from experience is the best teacher, but it's according to this quote, it's the bitterest. It's what hurts the most. So other people have obviously gone through bitter experiences and have learned the hard lessons that they've learned, and a lot of times they're willing to share, and we can learn from what's happened in their cases. And that's what a lot of risk control and stuff is. Hey, this bad thing has happened in the past. Let's figure out why that happened. Let's figure out a way to stop that from happening going forward, so that we can protect the asset that's at risk.
Exactly right. And we're going to do some of that here today. And hopefully we're going to be more focused on the reflection side of that conversation. And to a great degree, we're also going to spend a lot of time learning what to imitate. And hopefully we can, take that information and translate that into real experience in our areas of responsibility. So starting with that, I want to share with you information from a report. This is the 2018 Report to the Nations Global Study on Occupational Fraud and Abuse. This is by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. It's freely available on their website. You can see that, acfe.com. You can go ahead and visit that website, download the report. It is not short, but it is very good.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating study.
Lots of good graphics in it. I really liked them.
Yeah, and we'll look at some of those graphics. But I think this becomes one of the most comprehensive guides to the current state of fraud in the world today. And very nice feature of this particular report, it has sort of some big picture global data, but it also has information broken out by different parts of the world that may be experiencing some different dynamics. So if you're from another part of the world other than I'm located here in the United States right now, maybe you're listening from somewhere in the Caribbean or Africa, or who knows where you are. There is information for the different parts of the world in that report. So that could be of great use to you as you're looking at the trends in your area. So let's take a peek in here. The data from this that was used for this report came from 2016 and 17 in order to create the 2018 report. The previous report that we shared in webinars gone by was from 2014 report. So I don't know if they do a report absolutely every year, but from time to time they are able to report for us, and it is a fairly comprehensive study that they're able to do. So for that time period that I referenced, and let me just see if I can hide some of what's obscuring my vision here. Let's see here. So you can see some of the statistics. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly because this really sets the stage and helps us understand the nature of this type of risk and loss for us. But we don't want to just get stuck on this, obsessing over the statistics. But there was $7 billion in total losses measured in this study. And the median loss per case was $130,000. You can imagine, though, that median loss, there's a great deal of variety depending on which part of the world, which part of the market is being studied. There's quite a bit of variance in those specifics. But the median loss per case was $130,000.
It's really sad to see that. Like,
yeah,
it puts numbers on events that we hear about in the news or whatever, but it's sad to see the actual dollar figures.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, this is not to put too fine a point on it, but this is theft. 22% of cases caused losses of over $1 million.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. This gets into some very interesting information. Tips are by far the most common initial detection method. Tips, very interesting. At 40%.
How would you define a tip? Like, what would that's just like a local church member coming up and mentioning something, or a local employee mentioning something?
Exactly right. It's whether that person's known or anonymous. They just saw what we'll call a red flag, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later. They saw something that really made them concerned, and so they said something to someone who had the opportunity to look into it further and the access to do so. You'll see internal audits, only 15% were the method by which the initial detection was done, and management review at 13%. And I think those were the largest categories. And you can see tips was the largest by far.
Yeah.
And a few more details there, whether it was hotlines or was it employees and or outside parties, like somebody interacting with that organization. Here's a really, and I think this is a very relevant fact for our group, the Adventist Church, to think about. Small businesses lost almost twice as much per scheme to fraud as large businesses did.
Wow.
Yeah. And if we think through the practical realities of why that might be the case, it does seem obvious, and we'll talk through some of what might make the difference as we go along. But just consider for a moment the resources that a smaller organization has to bring to bear on preventing fraud, from providing oversight, from using systems that automate processes and bring in some of those automated protections. Much more difficult for a smaller organization to do rather than a larger organization.
I also think too, like in a small organization, everyone knows everyone probably, maybe, and there's that trust factor. Oh, I'm just going to trust everyone because I've had lunch with this guy before, and we know each other, and that makes people less willing to put in like controls into place, possibly because they don't see that as a need.
Right. Okay. I keep having fun advancing slides here. It's good times. Okay. Internal control weaknesses were responsible for nearly half of frauds. So there's a direct connection between internal control weaknesses. So we want to take what internal controls that we can implement very, very seriously, because when they're not in place or they're not well executed, if I can put it that way, you may end up with a scenario where that is really exposing your organization to some vulnerability in that area. And they had 18 anti-fraud controls that they were analyzing, and all 18 of those were associated with lower fraud losses and quicker detection. So they were measurably effective in preventing fraud. And we will spend some time looking at those controls. And Andrew, you'll speak to those. Yep. Here goes back to that idea of those smaller organizations may struggle with fraud a little bit more because of their ability to implement defenses and systems. So here it talks about data monitoring and analysis and surprise audits were correlated with the largest reductions in fraud loss and duration. And you can see the statistics there. But if your organization doesn't have the resources to implement that kind of a tool, or the personnel to engage in, what they call the surprise audit, and you might find yourself more exposed and missing out on that additional protection. In the Adventist Church, at least here in North America, the church policy is that and we don't even call it an audit exactly, called a review. And it's for each local church and school, the policy says that it needs to happen at least once every 2 years. So we want to see that taking place. I would love to see it taking place more frequently, but I think that is one of those examples of how a smaller organization like a local church or school does not necessarily have full benefit of those surprise audits. It's certainly not a surprise, and probably not happening as frequently as we might wish.
Yeah, my local church just had that just happened, and the treasurer, it was all scheduled and everything. So it's sort of like, in theory, she could have had everything planned so that the auditor didn't see stuff. So it's definitely not a surprise.
Right. So while we're talking about audits, what does an audit, I'm kind of going off script here, Andrew, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
What does an audit accomplish for a local church?
So you think of who the auditor is, like the report is addressed to. It's addressed to the church board and the conference. Those are the entities the bodies that don't have the time, or they're not digging through the details. The treasurer is the custodian of the assets and the liquid assets, and the board is the one that's responsible for them. So these audits are there basically to say, they're to tell the board, hey, the treasurer is being responsible with what you've entrusted them with. So it's not, the audit isn't, it is definitely reassuring to the treasurer to say, hey, I had a clean audit and I'm doing a good job, but it's really, the audit's really for the higher organizations to know that the person that's in the details and doing all of, you could say the grunt work or whatever, paying receipts and processing check requests and stuff, that's been done in an appropriate manner.
Right. So would we consider these local church reviews, do they effectively help us protect our local church or local organization there from fraud?
Oh, I'd say for sure. Like it's definitely something that's going to be showing what's been happening. It definitely might not find all the fraud that's happening out there, but it's definitely a measure that will lessen the chance of fraud.
Okay, so you're telling me it's not necessarily a magic bullet, but it's
Yeah,
definitely an effective tool in the
yeah,
toolbox.
yeah.
Okay.
Because you say you have a treasurer that says, no, you can't audit me ever. And I've heard those cases back in my parents' area, not my parents' church, thankfully. But it's the churches doesn't want to do that. And that's just a serious red flag that goes off. Why isn't this person letting us look into the financial details of this organization? What is going
Right.
on?
Right. So I see another question in our Q&A area, and I think we've answered the first one, but I'm going to ask about this next one as well. And I think I can answer this one, having read through the church manual on this particular subject not that long ago. And that was, the question is, can a pastor request that their local church's finances be audited outside of that regular 2-year audit? And the answer is, I believe, yes.
Yes.
Now, you're going to be asking the conference to come out here and do something that's outside of schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be a certain amount of, do they have the resources to do that? Can they accommodate the request? Typically, if you feel that there's a really good reason for it, they're likely going to be interested in helping you with that. They don't want to have fraud taking place any more than you do. So typically, I think you're going to find support for that. But a pastor could certainly be one of those people who typically should be able to see the statements and be able to review that information along with the board, and may detect some red flags that we're going to talk about here in a minute that might inspire that kind of, hey, you know what, we really need some help with this right now, and an audit would do us some good. Another question, let me hit really quick before we move forward, and that is, what was the reference point of the $7 billion in losses? And that was global. The study was done globally. Like I was saying, there's information from all around the world on that. So that's not just the United States, that's everywhere. All right, I wanted to share with you, we're not going to look in detail at this incredibly dense looking list here, but the question was, how does the presence of anti-fraud controls relate to median loss? Okay, so you have to understand that question there. And what rose to the top of that list was a code of conduct, right? So you can see that in 80% of the cases, with the control in place, the median loss was $110,000. With the control not in place, the loss was $250,000 with a 56% reduction. So that seems like one of those really important no-brainer things to implement in the organization is, what is the code of conduct? I've got to say, for an organization such as ours, we are a church organization. We, believe in the Bible. We believe really that, Scripture and God is the basis for morality. The concept of following a code of conduct and having a code of ethics should be inherent to us, and should be an area in which we excel. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to clarify what our expected code of conduct is, and we should be enthusiastic to hold that standard high. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you notice some of those that show the greatest percent reduction: code of conduct, proactive data monitoring and analysis, again, probably harder for the smaller organizations, surprise audits, which we've been talking about, and an external audit of internal controls over financial reporting. And then management review, and that goes again to what you were talking about, Andrew, the idea of the local church board needs to be able to review and make sure that that treasurer is an effective steward of those finances.
I think an important thing about that too is they need to understand what they're looking at. A lot of times we get in places where we just sign off on things and we're scared to ask questions, but that we need to be willing to ask questions and understand things so we can better do the responsibility that's been entrusted with us as a member of a board.
Exactly right. So you're telling me that even it's okay to ask a dumb question.
Of course, always.
Yeah, it really is. I think even when it is what they call a dumb question, there's usually a bunch of people wondering the same thing.
Yep.
And just because you don't know something doesn't make you dumb. You just haven't run across that data point yet in your life. How does the presence of anti-fraud controls relate to the duration of fraud? Right. So there's the actual loss amount, but there's also the idea of how long is the fraudulent activity taking place. And as you can imagine, there's a correlation between those two ideas. The longer that the fraudulent activity is taking place, the more money is being stolen. So if we look here at our list, some of the same elements are going to be near the top of our list. Proactive data monitoring and analysis was one of the top 5 on the previous slide. In 37% of cases, with a control in place, 10 months. With a control not in place, 24 months. That's a reduction of 58%. Surprise audits again. An internal audit department. I think of a local church, not likely to have an internal audit department, but you can go to the next one, management certification of financial statements. If an informed board is reviewing and knows what they're looking at, you can have that kind of management oversight and review of the information that's being communicated by the treasurer. Important tools, and all of the tools on this list are fantastic and we should look into. I just wanted to highlight some of those that caused the greatest reduction.
I'm sure there's more than just this list too. There's
no doubt.
There's tons of control.
What are the primary internal control weaknesses that contribute to occupational fraud? So these are sort of our greatest offender list, sort of looking at the problem from the opposite direction. And the one with the largest segment of the responsibility is lack of internal controls, just a complete lack of them. 26%, pardon me, lack of management review. I think this is one, that comment's really sticking with me, Andrew.
Yeah.
The idea that many times our boards, sometimes our pastors may not be very familiar and comfortable with what they should be looking for.
Yep.
What would look right and what would look wrong in this situation. So having the opportunity to do a review of the finances, very important. Knowing what you're looking at, just as important.
Yep.
19% overriding of existing controls. It doesn't do you a lot of good to have a control if it's just going to be disregarded.
Sometimes I think that'll happen when a control isn't designed properly, and it's overburdening to some person in some process, and that's, to me, that's just that's a warning saying, hey, maybe this control needs to be reassessed and looked at. What are we trying to accomplish with this control? What are we trying to protect, so that we can balance the overburdening of this control with the reality of, hey, we need to get these things processed. You're always in this balancing act.
Yeah, I guess it's really important for us to understand what the controls really can achieve and use the right tool for the job.
Yep.
I thought this next one was interesting. Poor tone at the top. I think this is one of the key issues in any risk management topic, and that is risk management, no matter what we're talking about, whether it's protecting children, physical assets, in this case, in monetary fidelity, leadership's ability to lead in that area and to hold a high standard is critical. And everyone else will take the tone at the top, and they will be following that. So setting that tone effectively at the top of what is expected is critical.
Yeah, I see that as being like the pinnacle one. If all those other issues that can happen, if you don't have controls, if what's happening is going to be driven probably by the people that are overseeing that organization or that process.
So here's just some summary information, kind of to wrap up our review of that report to the nations. You know, misappropriation of assets is 89% of the cases. So that's really what we're primarily looking at in the types of organizations that we are involved with here in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So that is also in the largest group category, and the median loss there was 114,000. And we're going to talk a little bit more about, you know, why do people commit fraud? And happily, we also have some resources and information on this topic that we're going to point you to as well, so that you have resources that you can, you know, read further and also share with your local church board or key leaders that really can help move the needle in the right direction on this particular topic. All right. Let's see here, Andrew. I think we're going to turn things over to you for a little bit. Oh no, I had one more quote. I just added this one because this one was shared with me this weekend. This is from Testimonies for the Church, and I think this is such a powerful statement from the Spirit of Prophecy. Belief in the near coming of the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven will not cause the true Christian to become neglectful and careless of the ordinary business of life. The waiting ones who look for the soon appearing of Christ will not be idle, but diligent in business. Their work will not be done carelessly and dishonestly, but with fidelity, promptness, and thoroughness. And this doesn't have only to do with, you know, monetary fidelity, but, you know, going back to that principle of the widow with her two mites, you know, and our responsibility to do the right thing with what is given from the heart to the Lord. I find this to be an inspiring and encouraging quote. I don't know, it does a lot for me. I hope it means something to those listening as well.
Yeah, I've heard, I don't know if it was a pastor or a friend that had a saying that they would always say that was similar to this. They always said, live for the future, but plan for today and tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Ellen White is saying in this quote.
Absolutely right. That's what I read as well. So walk us through preventing fraud, and we'll get into some of the internal controls here, which I think is getting into the meat of the matter.
Yes. So as we've sort of been already saying, everyone is responsible. Like I hinted at earlier, it's not just the treasury responsibility, it's the board, it's the deacons, it's pastor, conference treasurer, whoever is in a role of responsibility has a responsibility to look after the financial assets of that organization. We mentioned tone at the top as well. Whatever is the management, if they're emphasizing, hey, we want to be proactive about finding ways to stop things from happening that are fraudulent, that's going to trickle down through the organization and become a theme of that organization. We've been mentioning internal controls fairly a little bit, and we never really defined an internal control. That's a process an organization has in place to ensure integrity throughout their financial system. So you want to design these, like I was saying earlier, it's a balancing act. You're not wanting to overburden the treasurer or the people doing the work, but you're also wanting to protect the resources. And you think also that internal control they're designed for the board, but they also are designed for the treasurer as well. So if someone comes along and accuses the treasurer or a deacon of or whoever of misappropriating assets, they have those controls to fall back on. If they don't have those controls, then it's just their word versus somebody else's, and that's a bad position to be involved in. And the whole goal of a control is to limit the opportunity. We haven't mentioned that there's a fraud triangle that a fraudster is going to have an opportunity. They're going to have a rationalization of why this is something that they should be able to do, to justify it in their minds, and then they have to have the pressure, some sort of need financially to do that. And some of those are sort of hard to see, but there's opportunities. And the thing is, the goal of designing an internal control framework is to put in place to limit the opportunities for fraud to happen, so that the assets will be protected.
All right.
Anything to add on that, Dave?
No, I do not. I mean, that's setting up sort of how and the purpose of why this works. I think it'll be interesting for us to start getting into the nitty-gritty of what are various tools we can actually, controls that can actually be implemented.
That's the year. So we have lots of possible controls out there, and a lot of times we might just say we need to do all of them, and we need to be protected in all these different ways. But it's important to keep in mind that you know your organizations better than we do, or better than a lot of people do, and it's important to just sort of step back and think, where are our risks, where are potential opportunities that are out there where fraud could happen.
Right.
And then once you identify those opportunities, do a risk assessment, then you can put in some controls in place that will limit those opportunities. And these are some common controls. A big one on the financial side you hear about is segregation of duties. Are enough people involved in the process? A lot of times at like a smaller church, maybe there just isn't enough people at all, and you just have one person. But ideally, you want to find a way to separate out cash handling, like depositing, and you want to separate out who's recording the transactions. If someone has the ability to control the books as well as the money, then both sides of that is a lot more susceptible to a fraud from happening. When we think about cash is, a lot of times cash doesn't have a receipt. It doesn't have something that comes with it. If people just put money into an offering plate, and that's super susceptible to fraud from happening. So what I've always encouraged people at my church is give online, or have some sort of trail that comes with it, that protects and tracks that cash or that transaction as it comes in. And then we have spending authorities a lot of times in a local church, who is responsible for the treasurer. Obviously is going to have responsibility to pay out invoices and send out checks, but is there a maximum they can send out? Is there two signers need to be on a check? It's important to work with the local church and the conference and whatever organization that you're in, to figure out a process for spending. I mean, safeguard checks too. I think it's a weakness in my local church's controls is we put out reimbursement checks, and we have them just sitting in the business office in envelopes, and someone that was smart probably could walk in and walk off with one of those. Is there a better way we can disperse checks and get them to people without endangering the checks and the resources of the church. And then we've been talking a lot about management review and finding ways to give reports in an effective way so that people understand what's happening. One thing I really like is you have a check summary. Like there's a listing of all checks that went out, and then it's something that you can train the board to understand is, hey, if there's a gap in that sequence of checks, that's a immediate question for the treasurer. What happened with that check? Was it just a void check, or is something going on there? And get them to follow up and look into that. I think it's an important thing.
So if there is a gap in the check, does that mean fraud has taken place?
No, not. It could just be they made a typo on the check or something, but it's something that should be.
It's worth asking about.
Yeah, because say no one does ask, and then down the road the treasurer noticed that as, oh, I don't have to report all the checks on this check summary, and no one's probably going to notice this. By having someone that's engaged in the process and seeing and asking those questions, it limits the opportunity that the treasurer or person handling the checks is going to have. And we mentioned audit review of financial records. It doesn't stop all fraud, obviously, but it's a good way for people to get reassurance that things are materially being processed correctly. Then if we get training, I think of like you get a new church board, you get a new executive committee. We need to have training, teach them what their responsibility, what their job is. It's not just, hey, you have this new role and have at it and good luck. We need to have training that will tell people, hey, this is our local church, this is our conference's financial statement, this is what these things are meaning, right. So that the questions can be asked. And I've even heard of some conferences having like local treasurer training workshops that puts people that have the same responsibilities together so they can understand and learn from each other and figure out ways to better protect the assets.
Right. So that goes to a current question we have pending here as well so where do folks get the kind of training, whether it's the board, the pastor, or even somebody who's new to the treasury role? Maybe they're not an experienced treasurer, but they've been asked to serve. Maybe they've just been asked to count cash or something like that in the accounting room. Where might they get this kind of training? What are some options that might be available to them?
Yeah, I know like a lot of conferences will have resources in their treasury department, but like a GC level one that is moneywise.adventist.org, they have a lot of treasurer information about controls and about church financial structure and stuff like that I find really useful. It hits all levels of the church, and one of my old teachers from Andrews oversees it. Then you can also, if you may have heard of churchlawandtax.com, they have a ton of stuff about tax and how to do tax stuff, but they also have a whole finance section talking about internal controls, and you can sign up for their email newsletter. And I was just looking at it earlier today, and one of the articles was fraud in your church, 5 infographics to help assess your internal controls and possible vulnerabilities. That's a perfect article to read and to compare what it's saying to your local church or your entity and the financial controls that are in place, and see if there are places that can be improved.
Right. Very good. Okay, let's look at next. I think we're going to get into some, red flags.
Red flags.
I think this is really, really important, and we've had a few questions kind of skirting this topic. I think the thing for me when I'm just talking about red flags in general, and I'll let you walk us through these, but red flags are typically just that. They are not conclusive evidence that something has gone wrong or is going wrong but it's a good reason to look into it.
Yeah, it's a good data point.
It's a data point.
Yeah, and eventually you get enough data points, and you're like, maybe something is really wrong here, and it adds up. And we came back to one of the graphics from the fraud report, and it said 85% of fraudsters will give a red flag, and that's practically all fraudsters, I would say, almost, that are giving some sort of red flag, that's a warning to someone that's close to them, that's hinting at the possibility of maybe a fraud has already happened or a fraud is going to be happening, and something to file away in people's minds, to keep an eye out for. And these are just some of them. You see behavior changes. Maybe someone's under a lot of stress at work, or they've lost their job and they need financial resources for something in their life, and they have the opportunity, maybe in a church setting, that they have opportunities to get the money. Before they never would have done that in the past, but now that they have the pressure and the opportunity, then all they need from the fraud triangle is the rationalization of why it's okay for them to do that. So, and then you can also, maybe somebody has a lifestyle that's way above their type of job, and it's a question to wonder about, where is all of their resources coming from.
Right.
Definitely not something that you go out and you find a rich person that you know and say, hey, what's going on. But it's something just to keep in people's minds.
So if I were to go ahead and buy a yacht, would you start to have some questions?
Possibly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Something that was asked earlier was, a treasurer is not making their deposits in a timely manner, and that becomes evidenced from the, what is it called, the biannual, every 2 years.
Yeah, from the review, but like, it's also something that you can train like a church board to be looking out for. Like, you're gonna see, like, you expect, we had 4 Sabbaths in a month, then we should have had roughly 4 deposits, right? That would come in, because we know we did an offering each Sabbath.
Right.
So there are things like that, and you can also keep in mind, as you get it more exposed to like the financial statements of an organization, you can sort of see the trends developing. Okay, we roughly get this amount of money every Sabbath, so I times that by how many Sabbaths we had. We should roughly have about this amount of money coming in during the month. And those are just things that don't tell the whole story, but they can point you in a direction towards something.
I'm curious about this one on the list here. Likable and generous is a red flag. Why is being nice a red flag?
You think of people that they're going out of their way to cover up something, maybe, and they're always there to help. They're always wanting to be involved in things. Maybe that there's some reason that's an ulterior motive behind that. And obviously we have lots of likable people, and we don't want to stop having likable people. But if someone is seeming too nice, like I know there's some people that you get that feeling, like the last point on here, you get a gut feeling that sort of hints at something might not be right about this situation.
Right.
And these are all data points, and eventually they add up to something by themselves. Obviously they're not bad.
So an example comes to my mind.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, you'll run across a treasurer who just never steps away. They've been doing this for the last, 40 years. They do not take a vacation from it. They never leave. They're always there. You love them because they're just so faithful, and they always take care of it. Is that a good thing?
Yeah, it's a great thing, but there's also a risk with that comes with it. Like, if they're at a small church and they're the only person that has eyes on the money, and they've had the eyes on the money for 40 years or something, it's good to have another set of eyes involved in the process. Just obviously at some point they're going to be retiring from this role, and you want to have somebody ready to step in, someone that's been trained with them, assistant treasurer or something. But also it gets somebody else involved, so then it takes away the opportunity for them to cook the books, you could say. and cover up stuff because they know someone else is going to be doing a part of the process or looking over their shoulder in a way. So it's important to take a break.
Yeah, a vacation's actually maybe even a control in a sense.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
I think we've touched. If you have someone that's, are you relying so much on trust in your organization? We obviously trust a lot of people in our church, but that's not the sole thing that we base our processes on. We want to trust people, but we also want to protect them and the resources that is entrusted to them.
That's a good way to put it. It's a way to protect not just the resources, but the individuals involved.
Yep.
It's a two-way street for that. Very good. Oh, hey, somebody wanted you to mention those websites one more time.
Oh, yeah.
Church Law and Tax.
Yep,
and
Church Law and Tax, and then moneywise.adventist.org.
Moneywise.adventist.org.
And they have a lot of PowerPoint presentations from all sorts of places in the church structure.
Fantastic. Good resources.
Yeah.
And I would very much encourage everyone to reach out to your local conference.
Mhm.
They, the church tends to work with policy, in the church manual, which is widely available to everyone. But sometimes we have more specific rules at the GC, the division levels, the union levels in your local conference. And really, you may find some great resources and some very specific advice for your area from your local conference. And they may be able to, they're closest to you. They may be able to provide you some assistance in that area as well.
Yep.
All right. So what do we do if fraud is actually suspected?
Yes. So sadly, fraud could happen, and it's important to have a plan in place. Know what to do when that does happen. Importantly, it's important to act quickly. We want, obviously, someone that did fraud and they suspect that they might have been caught. It's going to be a chance that they might be covering things up or hiding things or who knows what. And it's important to get control of the assets or the data. Say it's on a treasurer's home computer or something. Those books aren't theirs. It's the church's books, and they should be removed from access to those. I guess I jumped ahead a little bit, but we obviously want to be reporting that to legal counsel and to ARM, and let them know that there potentially could be a fraud that happened. And you don't have to wait until you're sure the fraud happened. If there's a chance that fraud is happening, it's important to let people know so that the proper procedures can be put in place to mitigate the loss and get it cared for. And law enforcement obviously needs to be brought in because this is a crime. If someone's been committing fraud and stealing, this isn't something that we try to cover up and protect them. It's a crime, and there's criminal processes and penalties for doing a crime.
Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. One thing I wanted to point out here at the beginning is definitely involve your conference. And some of these bullet points, some might look at it as do it in this order.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's pretty much do those all very quickly at the same time. The order of it for those early ones particularly, they need to happen quite swiftly if you're going to have any chance of doing that last one, of securing the data. And often when we find some case of fraud taking place, the concept of an iceberg principle is just that there's often much more going on than is immediately obvious. So Andrew, your point about getting that information safe is you do need to move very, very quickly to make that happen. All right, thank you. Wanted to mention that the church does have a master insurance policy on this for this risk. And it is a master policy. So there's a single insurance policy that covers all organizations of the church, and local treasurers are covered on that. It is a crime bond, and there's a limit. You see there are various deductible amounts, deductible being the portion you pay. So your organization would be paying if you have a loss. And it is different in different parts of, for different organizations, depending on different parts of the world and the different types of organizations that are part of our church. So um, what you do need to know, and we're not going to give a lot more details on that in this particular presentation, but what you do need to know is that there is an insurance policy in place, and it is a crime bond. So sometimes people are recommended, hey, you need to get your treasurers, a bond on them. That is already in place. One of the related topics, and Andrew, you were just speaking about this, is that at least here in the North American division, which is where I live and you live, we serve the World Church, but we're located here. There is working policy that says when a volunteer or an employee of a Seventh-day Adventist organization performs an act in violation of the laws of the country and of the financial trust or responsibility reposed in him or her, discipline shall be administered, and the church will report the violations to appropriate law enforcement. So this is not a condition of the insurance policy, but it is a condition of our working policy of how we as a church have decided to conduct ourselves. So if you're wondering whether or not, to report somebody to the authorities because you just don't want to, because often they are very, very nice people that you've been friends with for years, it is very, very important. You are expected to do that. And hopefully, if they are not guilty of anything, that's what an investigation will determine. So someone asked a question earlier, and I didn't get to it. And I don't think we're going to come back to a topic within which it really fits nicely. So let's answer this one before I go any further. And that was, how often should church board members review bank statements? Do they review bank statements? And if so, how often, I guess?
Yeah, I would, my initial response to that would be that the church board can review the statements. I would say a financial report of the financial assets of the church probably would be more applicable to a board, but we obviously, you could have somebody else reconciling the bank statements with the ledger. That's not the treasurer, or you could have somebody that collects the money, and someone that records it, and then someone that reconciles. So you have three people involved in the process. It all just sort of depends on the situation and the current dynamic of the entity that you're in. But it's definitely, the board can review. I think the board has a lot more other responsibilities to do, like ministry of the church. So that can be, I'd say that can maybe be a little overburdening to a church, but it's something that definitely is an option if the church sees that it needs that.
Okay. And one more question that was asked was, what actually is a crime bond? We referenced it. And essentially, a crime bond, a fidelity bond is another word, is a form of insurance protection that covers policyholders for losses that they incur as a result of fraudulent acts by specified individuals. In this case, for those entrusted with our finances, treasurers at local churches and schools. Typically, it will insure a business for losses caused by the dishonest acts of its employees. So that's what that is. Okay, nearly there, folks, and I realize this has been a long one.
Yep.
But I want us to end on again, a positive. We've looked at some, crime is and stealing and fraud are not pleasant topics, but there is something that we want to reemphasize here. And Andrew, lead us through some of these ideas.
Yeah, like I think there's a lot of people in our church doing a lot of good things, and they're putting a lot of hours and time. And a lot of times we focus on the bad things that happen, and it's important, I think, to also recognize good things, and a lot of bad things aren't happening. So we should be
Absolutely.
celebrating those and thanking people and really appreciating them. I think it's hard sometimes. We take things for granted, and we want to just work on the issue at hand and the problem at hand, but a lot of times there's a lot of good things that are happening. Um,
Absolutely right. And reasons, we talked about some motivations at the beginning, and I loved something you had said. It goes along the lines of the last bullet point, and that was financial health should be celebrated. So when you have a great treasurer who's keeping you afloat, and sometimes we'll say no, just because there isn't enough money to do every idea. You know what? Somebody who's keeping you afloat in that way is a real blessing, and they should be celebrated. And your financial health of your organization should be celebrated. It is a good goal to pursue. And so often we're just looking for ways to, um, what could we spend next? What could we buy next? But we all should be invested in the care and stewardship of these assets and these funds, um, and the financial health of our organizations. And that's not something for us to be ashamed of. That's something we should be celebrating. And so my own thanks goes out to those of you who are serving in that area, and just a big thank you from me. And I think, Andrew, you probably can relate to that as well.
Oh yeah, I think I think in the church a lot of times we're praying for our church to be well and to do good things, and part of an answer to that prayer is we're blessed financially, and we have the resources to do God's work and reach the lost in this world.
Amen. Just want to close with this last quote. We couldn't end without a quote. This is from Ninth Testimony. The tithe is sacred, reserved by God for himself. It is to be brought into his treasury to be used to sustain the gospel laborers in their work. And that is so true, so important. And it's an awesome responsibility, but hopefully we've pointed to some of the risks and some of the tools today that will help equip you even further. I wanted to mention as well, you referenced those fantastic websites, and I see that Elizabeth has shared those in the chat back and forth with everyone. I also want to point out the fact that Adventist Risk Management has, on our website, we have safety resources. And if you go to the church or the school section of safety resources, there we have added a new section called finance. And there's a resource in there on the fraud triangle that we were able to produce. It has some of the red flags and some of the controls conversation there. There's also a fantastic resource, quite a bit longer. I think it's 24, 25 pages long, from our insurance carrier, Chubb, ACE. You may have heard of them if you're familiar with the global insurance market. And they have a fantastic resource there as well, that you may find very, very practical and useful at your local churches. So become familiar with that. Our website is adventistrisk.org. It's been in the footer of every slide, adventistrisk.org. Just go to the church or school resources and you'll see that there. Thank you to everyone who joined us today and making this a priority and a topic. I see some names in the attendee list that are friends from different churches that I've met around the world. So that's really, really cool to see you there. Thank you for taking the time. God bless you and your ministries, and whatever it is that you do to serve the Lord. We want to say thank you, and thank you, Andrew, for taking the time to share with us from your expertise.
Of course, it's been a pleasure.
All right, everyone, take care and God bless. Bye.